Hi, I'm Matt from the great city of Durham, North Carolina. Seminary Dropout with Shane Blackshear is supported by listeners like you and me. You should support the show like I did. It's easy, just visit supportseminarydropout.com and click Become a Patron.
You're listening to Seminary Dropout, episode 54, and I'm your host, Shane Blackshear. This week on the show, we'll be talking with Old Testament scholar, the Walter Brueggemann. Also, I'll explain what that intro was about. All this and more on this week's episode of Seminary Dropout. Let's go. You heard right. This week on the show, one of the world's most preeminent Old Testament scholars, Walter Brueggemann. It will not disappoint, I promise. And then we'll talk a little bit about that intro that you heard from my friend Matt. Matt, thanks so much for doing that. Listen, it's a pretty cool thing. It's a way to support the show, but there are things like prizes involved, rewards for supporting the show. And I will explain all of it in detail at the end of the show, so please hang on, stick around. It'll be worth your wait. There's also a pretty cool video involved that some of the past guests on the show were kind enough to help me out with. So I'll be telling you all about that at the end of the show, so hang on. It's hard to introduce someone like Walter Brueggemann. There are just too many accolades to mention. Yes, he's got degrees from Elmhurst College, Eden Theological Seminary, Union Theological Seminary, and a doctorate from St. Louis University. He's written books, too, at least 58 of them by my count. He's received numerous awards, too, including the Distinguished Alumnus Award from Union Theological Seminary and the Luce Theological Fellowship from the Association of Theological Schools. He was named an honorary member of the British Society of Old Testament Study. He received both the Academy of Parish Clergy Book of the Year Award and the Catholic Press Association Book of the Year Award for Theology of the Old Testament. The Association of Theological Booksellers named Brueggemann's An Introduction to the Old Testament, the Canon and Christian Imagination, Best Academic Book in 2004. Brueggemann was also inducted as an honorary admiral in the Nebraska Navy, which I don't even know how that works. Nebraska has a Navy? So yeah, he's done all of that, but still it doesn't seem to adequately describe who Walter Brueggemann is. So I'll just say that above all else, what impresses me most about Walter Brueggemann is that after all these years, he is humble enough to sit down and talk with someone like me. Dr. Brueggemann, thanks so much for joining me on the show today.
I'm delighted to be with you and get to talk with you.
Well, we're here to talk about your latest book, Reality, Grief, Hope. It's essentially somewhat about history repeating itself. You compare Israel's response to the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BC to America's response to 9/11. What ways were those events similar?
Well, I think they are similar in that a quite particular, limited historical crisis was invested with huge symbolic significance, so that 9/11, taken factually, was not that big an event. But I think it has become a huge symbolic event because what it represents is a kind of completely new awareness of the vulnerability of our society. And I think that the destruction of Jerusalem in the Old Testament was the same kind of discovery of surprising vulnerability, because in that ancient city, they had assumed that Jerusalem would be safe forever because it was protected by God. And I think that we have been tempted to think in the United States that somehow we had special guarantees from God, and now all of that is kind of nullified, and we cannot proceed on that assumption anymore.
American exceptionalism is the big ideology that we've kind of bought into this country that you address in the book. And it's worth noting that when in the book you use the word ideology, it's always in a negative way and tends to have the meaning of kind of the opposite of reality. How do you define American exceptionalism, and what is it about it that makes it so poisonous to us?
I think American exceptionalism is the conviction not only that we are a peculiar, unprecedented society in the history of the world, but that we are somehow invested peculiarly with the purposes of God, so that God has kind of signed on for our well-being. And what becomes pernicious about that is that it is treated as though no matter what we do, we always have the high moral ground, and we sort of have permission to do for self-advancement whatever we want to do, no matter what it costs other people. And I think you can make a case, of course, that the United States is peculiar, but when it turns out to be a sense of entitlement against the rest of the world, then I think it's very destructive. And you're right. I do use the word ideology negatively. It wouldn't have to be used so, because some people use it otherwise. But I mean by it the holding to a conviction, even when all of the data tells against that conviction. And I think the data around the world would suggest to you that we may not any longer be God's special privileged people in the history of the world, but we continue to cling to that conviction anyway.
Which was pretty much exactly the way Israel felt after the destruction of Jerusalem.
Exactly. That's why I drew the parallel. I think that's exactly correct. Yeah.
Well, and when we draw that parallel, luckily we're kind of given an example of the right way to move forward, which you talk about. The Old Testament prophet's response was, one, the assertion of reality, which is, the opposite of the ideology, what's really going on. They give a voice to grief, you say, and then they offer real hope against despair. I'm curious about which prophets in what situations are good examples of this in the Old Testament.
Well, I think that the reality against ideology, the way I've phrased that, I think pretty much the prophets in the 8th century BCE, Amos, Micah, Isaiah, and then in the 7th century, particularly Jeremiah and Zephaniah, what they were all doing in their poetic idiom is that they were trying to describe the reality in which they lived, which was quite remote from the liturgical self-deception in which royal Jerusalem imagined itself. I think that in terms of grief, I've identified some other texts, but I think particularly the book of Jeremiah is a book of grief that is recognizing the loss of regal Jerusalem and is very sad about it. And then in all those books, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Isaiah, there is an explosion of hope that comes in the 6th century in the exile after the destruction. So what I tried to do in that little triad was to piece together what I thought the prophets in the 8th and the 7th and the 6th centuries BCE were doing as they wanted their contemporaries to experience their life in the world differently. And I wrote the book because I want to suggest that we have the same prophetic, poetic task now to try to help people experience what is happening in our common life differently, which we cannot do as long as we engage in self-deception.
Yeah, so you bring up a good point. How do we participate in those prophetic tasks today?
Well, I think it's a huge challenge for us. My primary target is, of course, the church, and I think that the church has work to do exactly from these texts. But of course, the church and the synagogue and the mosque have very important allies in the world of journalism and in the world of the arts. So I think in many ways the arts are vehicles through which the world gets presented and described differently. So I don't think it is peculiarly the task of the church, but I do think it is the task of the church, and I think we need to find all of the allies that we can muster in these hard tasks that really evoke a good bit of resistance.
It's funny that you bring up art because you use a lot of poetry, and the prophets use metaphors and images that were somewhat vague and open to interpretation. And I'm curious to know if there's some that you see using that kind of prophetic language in the church right now.
Well, as you know, I tried to, around those three tasks, I tried to cite some contemporary poetry that was not cast in religious idiom, but I think was working at those tasks. And I think that the biblical imagery itself really can be exploited a great deal. The Jeremiah has a great deal of imagery of war and violence. The prophets love the imagery of marital fidelity and infidelity. Ezekiel uses the holiness language of profanation and abomination, and I think those are all terms and images that can readily be used to read out. I think that the management of money in our society and the war that we conduct on the poor, I do believe it's an abomination, and I think that we may require the kind of poetic rhetoric of extremity to try to help people see what in fact we are doing to ourselves. Mm-hmm. So I think we have wonderful work to do about unpacking that kind of imagery. And many of the poems that I cite, some of which come from venues of poverty or third world venues, artists continue to fashion new image and new metaphor that can be very useful to us, I think.
You kind of, in the last section of the book, you kind of reframe the argument in terms of neighbor versus empire, and some things that you just now touched on, and because you've had a past of talking about how the status quo in the Old Testament had a stake in making things seem peaceful when they were not peaceful, when destruction was coming, because it kept those in power, which seems to be a little about what you're alluding to there. I'm curious, for those who haven't read the book yet, can you explain a little bit of that dynamic of neighbor versus empire?
Let me say, first of all, that business about saying peace when there is no peace, as you are aware, is a direct quote 2 times from Jeremiah. And I think now we're getting all kinds of reassurances in political rhetoric that we're going to solve all these problems, we're going to return back to normal and all that kind of, which is really nonsense. I mean by empire, the organization of political power and economic power so that it is highly concentrated in the hands of people who sit on top of the pyramid and who really are largely indifferent to the needs or the suffering of people who are much further down the economic ladder and much less significant politically. And obviously, I think that the American economy is now organized as an empire, which is designed through the control of government and the control of the courts to flow all of the money to a few privileged people. Neighborhood, by contrast, is an image for the common good, which says that everybody who is present in the community is a significant member, and is entitled to some kind of care and some kind of well-being. So I use those two images that live very close to economic reality to describe two quite different attitudes about how to administer political power and how to operate the economy for the good of all or for the good of the few at the expense of the rest. And I don't think it takes much imagination to see that that's a fairly accurate description of the question that is now in front of us in our society.
I'm curious to know some of the real world examples and current events and things that serve to further that empire that benefits a few at the expense of many.
Well, I think you could talk anywhere, but I would think, for example, Warren Buffett's statement some time ago that his secretary paid a higher rate of taxes than he did. Well, that's not an accident. It's because the people that belong to Warren Buffett's economic class, not he, but many of his class, are the people that controlled Congress and write the tax laws. So the by and large, the government apparatus and certainly the Supreme Court are now controlled by a few powerful, privileged people, so that court rulings and government arrangements about taxes and mortgages and loans and credits, all those kind of things, the laws are written to protect the big banks and large concentrated interests. And all of that is going on in this most affluent society, while college students are running up huge debts that they will spend the rest of their life paying off. So when some people's wealth grows exponentially while college students from poor families are doing that, you just have to ask what's wrong with this picture. And it's not an accident. It's not a matter of piously acknowledging that some are less fortunate and some others are more fortunate. It's not a matter of being fortunate. It's a matter of controlling the legislative apparatus and writing the laws that benefit some to the loss of others. And I just think there are endless examples of that. The big argument about the Affordable Care Act is the fear that some of us are going to have to pay for health care for people who can't pay for themselves, and that has to do with neighborliness. But when the whole matter gets framed according to the financial benefits of the few, then the whole conversation becomes false from the start.
Something, Dr. Brueggemann, that I struggle with is, to what degree, if any degree at all, should we try to change the empire, or should the church's job be establishing an alternative, not empire, but alternative structure to the empire?
Yeah. Well, I think we have to work at both tasks. But I think the development of alternative structures, which is a very good thing to do, I don't think it has much chance unless we are working at the other task of modifying the empire. So, for example, I think that the development of food co-ops and the accent on local foods, I think that is terrifically important. But I think until the delivery system of the mega delivers of food, until that also is renovated and transformed, then I just think that the co-op movement by itself will remain quite marginal and not having great impact. So I really think it's not an either or. I think we have to work at both those tasks all the time.
You make in the book a few allusions to global warming, and I'm curious how the prophetic task of the church, speaking to something like that, how that would work.
Well, I think that the global warming is a very complex question, and I don't believe that anybody, including the church, has any solutions to that. But I also think that our incredibly indulgent way of living is hugely damaging of our environment. And I think that American exceptionalism has now morphed into a kind of consumer indulgence in which we are entitled to everything that we can get our hands on that belongs to other people, and we don't care what the impact of that is. I think that the military, I just heard a program on NPR today about how the Navy's sonic experimentations were doing great damage to the whale population. Well, our argument always is, well, if it has to do with national security, that's just too bad for the whales. And I think all of those questions need to be repositioned so that we can think about the maintenance of our exceptionalism in the world and what the long-term costs of that are to our grandchildren. You hear people all the time talking about balancing the federal budget so that we don't leave our grandchildren a huge debt. But you don't hear people talking about what if we leave our grandchildren this incredible global warming in an environment that is unlivable and unsustainable. So those are questions that we resist asking in our society. And as you know, anytime you raise a question of global warming, the answer is you can't do anything that will slow the economy. Well, that's absurd, but that's the answer we give because we are so invested in an economy of greed that we can't imagine doing anything that would curb it.
I think, too, that global warming is the perfect example of the dichotomy that you speak of ideology versus reality. When, how many more studies need to be done? How much of the majority of scientists need to, come out supporting the idea of man-made global warming before we face up to the reality that it is a real thing?
Exactly.
That fits into that dichotomy that you talk about, ideology versus reality, perfectly.
Yep. And now it is fashionable for politicians to say, well, I'm not a scientist, but, and then they go on to deliver all of this capitalist palaver anyway, as though you can just with a half a sentence dismiss all of the scientific data. Yep.
Yeah. Well, and I'm kind of getting off track, but the idea that I'm not a scientist, well, then you should defer to the scientists who
exactly
overwhelmingly majority say that it's a real thing.
That's right.
You showed how the prophecies of Isaiah were misused by the Jerusalem elite to preach a false message and enforce the status quo that we talked about. How do we know today that we're not misusing Scripture?
Well, we cannot be sure. We have a good tradition of interpretive methods, and we have to try to pay attention as much as we can recover original meanings, and then to do the hard work of interpretation about how do you translate what seem to be original meanings to our own time. And I think one of the important checks on that is that we need to test our scripture interpretations by people who live in other cultures, and particularly by people who live on the underneath side of the economy. And if our reading of Scripture doesn't ring true for those other kinds of folks in those populations, then we need to look at what we're doing. And if we test it that way, we can become aware, much more aware, of how our ideology has impacted our interpretation and has led us to false interpretations. I don't think there's any answer in the back of the book about that, but I do think that to broaden the points of reference in the interpretive community so that we wind up not just talking to ourselves is a really important test for how we interpret.
You specifically talk about people who claim to be spiritual but not religious. That's something we hear a lot of people say today. You say that they do it in an attempt to declare themselves free from any theological tradition and create a fully disembodied faith. I think some of that dates back to the New Age movement of decades past, but I'm curious why you think that might have seen a resurgence in the last several years.
Well, I think it's a really good point, and I think it obviously represents the extreme individualism of our society. I think that so much of it has to do with the attitude that nobody can tell me what to think about anything, and I know as well as anybody else, so I'm just going to go on my own. And I think the other side of it is the wounding performance of the authoritarian church, and I think the church in many expressions has made itself highly suspect, so that when people say that I'm not religious, what they really mean is I'm going to keep my distance from the institutional church. And I think the wounding church on the one hand has to do with a lot of authoritarian evangelicalism that tries to govern people by fear. And obviously the Roman Catholic epidemic of child abuse, I think, has cost all churches a great deal of credibility, and I think that this spiritual and not religious is a resolve to stay free of those church institutions that smack of hypocrisy and all of that. But I think, as your comment just suggested, to imagine, therefore, that I am not rooted in some theological tradition of some kind is simply illusionary. Nobody starts at square one. We are all inheritors of traditions, whether we know it or not. And I think a good bit of self-knowledge could really be important about that. To find out what is it that I am embracing, what is it that I am resisting, because it is never as simple as though it's just me, I think.
Our theology doesn't exist in a vacuum, does it?
That's correct. That's exactly right. Yep.
I want to transition and give you some questions that our listeners have posed for you. And so, a lot of these we're going to go beyond your most recent book that we've been discussing and kind of to your general, the bulk of your writings over the years. Lane says, you've always had great things to say about expressing anger and disappointment in prayer. Would love to hear more about that. How have you done this in your own devotional life, and have you seen it be effective for others?
Well, the second part of that is easy. Yes, I have seen it effective for others. I think that when you do the lament psalms and their expressions of anger and all of that, people are simply astonished that it's in the Bible, and they are astonished that they have permission to do that. And I think it's a huge unloading of freight that you don't have to carry. I would say that my own prayer life is intimately linked to what I write. I do believe that most of our writing is autobiographical, and so when I write this stuff, I am in process of doing it, and so I came to adulthood with a huge amount of anger about the way in which my father, who was a pastor, had been abused by the churches he served and all that kind of stuff. So I know a good bit about anger, and I also know I'm not finished with it. So my wife regularly points out to me that I am a carrier of anger, and that's probably what makes me attentive to the expressions of that stuff in the Psalms. And I have no doubt, on the one hand, it is certainly psychological catharsis to lay one's anger out for God, but I also think it's a theological transaction. It is really handing it over to God and trusting God with that. My own practice of that includes a good many years of psychotherapy, which in terms of just human communication also have to do with processing of that. But I think handing it over to a therapist, for example, is not fully the same as handing it over to God. And I am convinced out of my own life and my own experience that both those modes of a human transaction and a transaction with God are really elemental to well-being.
I cringe when people make the case that Christians shouldn't get angry. I think there's something unhealthy and probably psychologically damaging to deny yourself a human emotion that God put inside of us. Now, how we deal with that might be differently, but I like what you're saying, because it sounds like God can, instead of taking that emotion away completely, God is able to redeem that with everything else inside of us.
I think that's right. The Episcopal Church, in which I now worship, opens almost every liturgy with the prayer to the God from whom no secret can be hid. And I think this honesty about what we going on is an awareness that we do not need to hide that from God, and in fact we cannot hide it from God. It is the articulation of it to God and the confidence that God is receiving it really is an emancipatory act. And if we don't do that, then we know very well that our angers will break out in other ways that we didn't intend. And I think it's easy to cite examples of that.
The next question from the listener is, this is from Samuel. He said, how does your view of current scholarship on the Old Testament, or I guess he meant to say, what is your current view of scholarship in the Old Testament? So many competing ideas about sources, redactors, authors, and dates.
Yes, Old Testament study now is very pluralistic, and there are so many alternative ways that are being proposed to do that, and I think all of them can instruct us. My own habit out of my graduate school training was really to pay attention to the rhetoric of the text and not to get too much preoccupied with the history of the text or editing or redacting, but to look at the text that's in front of us and to see how the words work to create a new world of imagination. I try to keep up with what's going on in the field, so I read the work of scholars who do many different kinds of things. I think that currently a very hot enterprise is what is called a post-colonial interpretation, through which we become aware that those who live in the privileged West have a long habit of reading the Bible to the benefit of our Western entitlement and privilege. And we really need voices, interpretive voices from the third world to show us how our interpretation is skewed and to teach us in fresh ways about how we can begin to see the text differently. So I think all of these different approaches really represent a collegium of people who have to keep learning from each other, because the truth of the matter is that the biblical text just outruns all of our methods and all of our perspectives, and so we need people alongside us who see things in it differently from the way in which we see things in it.
That's good. Well, the last question comes from Chase, and he says, going back to at least the prophetic imagination, which for listeners who don't know, this is one of probably Dr. Brueggemann's most famous work. It was really a big deal, impactful. He says Brueggemann seems to have little use for the wisdom writings. And in particular, he seems to be down on Solomon. He says that those writings are there to enforce the status quo and suppress imaginative thinking that would challenge the stability of social structures that favor the elites. If this is so, what use is there, if any, for these writings to the church today? Should they have been included in the canon at all?
I am down on Solomon. I think Solomon functions himself in the Bible as a metaphor for selfish greed and indulgence and entitlement. I have a very high regard for the wisdom traditions. In one's scholarly life, you can't study everything. And I sort of made a decision that my field of work was going to be the prophets and the Psalms and more like that. But I think that the Proverbs are very the book of Proverbs and the wisdom tradition are very valuable because they represent a kind of an urbane, critical perspective on life in the world, and they don't happen to be the pieces of scripture that grip me, but that doesn't mean they're not important. And we should, in any case, leave in scripture the parts that we don't like, because in another time and another place, people are going to find them useful, and we keep what we don't use for another day. And I think that's certainly true for the wisdom traditions. So I guess it's right to say some of my best friends are wisdom scholars, and I keep learning from them and being instructed by them.
Well, the book is Reality, Grief, Hope, 3 Urgent Prophetic Tasks. Dr. Brueggemann, it's been so great talking with you today. Thanks so much for joining me on the show.
Thank you, Shane. It's wonderful to get to be with you and with your folks down there.
Did you like that interview with Walter Brueggemann? Did you benefit from it? Have you benefited from past episodes with people like Richard Foster and Philip Yancey and Christina Cleveland and Tony Campolo, Shane Claiborne? I cannot believe the people I've been able to interview on the show. If you like it, if you benefit from it, if you get something from it, I'm going to be very bold and ask you to consider supporting Seminary Dropout. I've just launched a new campaign on this new site called Patreon. Most of you are probably familiar with Kickstarter. With Kickstarter, there's one big project. You set a goal, and if you make it, you get that goal. And if you don't, you get nothing. And so that doesn't really work well for podcasts because it's an ongoing thing. Once a week, I publish an episode of Seminary Dropout. And so I've thought in the past, maybe I'll do a season. I'll fund a whole season through Kickstarter. Well, I don't like that if I set the goal too high, then nothing happens. We get nothing. And if I set it too low, it's too low, and I would have to wait a whole other year to fund the next season and up the bar a little bit. But luckily, this site called Patreon has come around. It's for artists who create things on an ongoing basis, like a podcast. So it's perfect for Seminary Dropout. I've just launched the campaign. If you're listening to this, it's live right now. You can go to supportseminarydropout.com. And it works a little bit like Kickstarter in that there are different levels that you can give to. And for each of those levels, there are rewards that you get. So for instance, if you give just 25 cents, just a quarter per episode, which would be $1 a month or $12 a year, you can do an intro to the podcast like Matt just did before. If you give $1.25, you can, per episode, you can do the intro and you can plug your blog or your website. You know, as long as it's appropriate, then great. And it goes up for there. $2.50 or more per episode. We're going to do a Google Hangout once a month. And everyone who donates at that level will get an invite to the Google Hangout. $5 per episode. I'm going to give you a call. We will chat it up. You will have my phone number in your phone, and you can call me whenever you want. And for $10 per episode, and let me be honest, okay? I'm not asking you to do this. If someone has that kind of income and they can do that, they can give $40 a month for Seminary Dropout. You're going to co-host the show with me once. And so that was the reward I could come up with. That's the other thing I like about Patreon is they emphasize rewards that don't cost money. Because if you'll notice on Kickstarter, half the money is spent on fulfilling the rewards. And I think that you would rather the money go to fund the show. Now, there's also goals. So, for instance, I've got 2 goals up there, and when we get to those 2 goals, I'll add some more. The first goal is when we get to $15 per episode, which is very attainable. We might get to that in the next couple of weeks or so. That will enable me to do things like put a microphone in the mail to my guests. The most common and almost the only gripe I get about Seminary Dropout is that the audio quality for the guest is not good enough. Well, look, I'm working with whatever they have on their end, which is sometimes just their laptop's built-in microphone, which is usually not very good. So if we get $15 per month, I'll be able to package a microphone, send it off to them, mail it off to them, include an envelope where they can mail it back to me, and it's no cost to the guest. And so you'll see the audio quality of my guests go way up. I really want to do that. So that's the first one. And then when we reach $25 per episode, I'm going to add a new segment to the show. And I don't know exactly what it'll be. It may be something different every time, but there will be a full additional segment to the show, probably after the interview segment. And it will be good. It will be entertaining or informational or educational. It'll be worth it. Trust me. So, and I forgot to mention the biggest part of this. I have, for my Patreon site, when you go there, remember, you can get there by going to supportseminarydropout.com. I've got this amazing video that some of the past guests on Seminary Dropout were kind enough to make for me. I emailed a bunch of past guests and I said, hey, would you mind just filming just a few minutes and telling me X? I didn't tell them what to say. I just told them what I wanted to know from them. And oh my gosh, I'm so thankful for these people. They're so amazing. They took time to do this. So there's an awesome video that you've got to check out. Listen, if you can't give for whatever reason, no, you can't even do the 25% per month, still go to supportseminarydropout.com and click play on the video and watch this video that we put together. It's so good. And yeah, I think that's it. Some people have been asking a question. Just a few close people that I've talked to about this before. They said, can we give, but not on an ongoing basis? You can, but not through Patreon. You can still go to the website, to ShaneBlackshear.com, and click on support. If you just want to do a one-time donation, that's totally fine. But I would challenge you, I would ask that if you just want to do, like, for instance, say you just wanted to give one time you wanted to give $15. We'll divide that 15 up by 4 episodes a month by 12 months in a year, and do it that way. So you're giving a much less amount per episode that will equal that amount that you want to pay over the course of the year. So for those, I've got a few people who've given in the past, and they've just given through my site because I hadn't set up the Patreon website. Let's just keep it that way. Let's just keep it where it is. I don't want you to have to do any additional work. Thank you so much. Oh, and for you people who have already done that in the past, I'll give you every reward that I'm giving people who are donating on the Patreon site. So if you have any questions about any of this for me, you can always reach me at ShaneBlackshear.com, ShaneBlackshear.com. And I'm happy to field any of those questions. I was trying to think of the rewards, and I hope that they are rewarding for you. I hope they adequately thank you for your contribution. I thought about doing something like, if you come to Austin, which a lot of people do for various reasons, reward could be we could go out for a coffee or a beer or a meal or something like that. But frankly, I thought, if any person who listens to Seminary Dropout came through Austin and wanted to do that, I would love to do that, whether they give or not. And so I decided not to do that for that reason, because any of you out there, if you come through Austin, shoot me an email, shoot me a tweet, whatever. And if I've got time, I would love to meet you face to face. So that's how I came up with the rewards. And yeah, I just want to say thank you. So I hope you consider it. Remember, check it out, supportseminarydropout.com. So that's all I've got this week. Thank you all. And join us next week for another great episode of Seminary Dropout.
To be all that I can be, and at my best I always seem to bring that. But there's still hope for me. This grace that I've received, and though you've loved your enemy, and you turn the other cheek, so I could